The October rain fell in sheets across Westchester County, turning the manicured suburban lawns into mirrors that reflected nothing but darkness. Aaliyah Brooks stood on the sidewalk outside the house she'd called home for 3 years, watching her husband throw her final suitcase onto the rain-soaked curb with enough force to split the fabric. Ryan Caldwell didn't look at her face as he did it. He hadn't looked at her face in months, not really. Not since the pregnancy test, not since his mother moved closer, not since he'd decided that the quiet black woman he'd married was somehow less than the life he deserved. "That's everything," he said, his voice flat and rehearsed, like he'd been practicing this moment. Behind him, framed in the warm light of the doorway, Patricia Caldwell stood with her arms crossed, silver hair, perfectly styled, despite the late hour. Her expression, carrying that particular blend of satisfaction and moral superiority that Aaliyah had learned to recognize in the first month of marriage. "Finally," Patricia said, her voice cutting through the sound of rain hitting pavement. "Finally, you're doing what should have been done months ago, before she trapped you permanently with this situation." Her eyes dropped to Aaliyah's 6-month pregnant belly with undisguised contempt. Aaliyah said nothing. She'd learned, over 3 years, that Patricia Caldwell's cruelty fed on reaction, grew stronger with resistance. Silence, she discovered, was both shield and documentation. Every insult that met silence was an insult that couldn't be twisted, reframed, blamed on Aaliyah's oversensitivity. So she stood in the rain, one hand resting on her belly, and she watched. Ryan shifted uncomfortably, his expensive loafers, the ones Aaliyah had helped him pick out for his promotion interview, already soaked through. For just a moment, something flickered across his face. Doubt, maybe. Or the ghost of the man who'd once smiled at her across a Columbia networking event and made her think that normal, uncomplicated love might actually exist. But then Patricia spoke again, and whatever weakness Ryan had almost shown evaporated like steam. "Don't tell me you're having second thoughts," Patricia said, moving onto the porch. "After everything we've discussed?" She made her choices, Ryan. She got pregnant knowing full well. "Mom," Ryan said. But it wasn't a protest. It was a plea for her to stop talking, to let him preserve whatever fiction he'd constructed where he wasn't the villain of this story. Patricia descended the steps with the bearing of someone who'd never been told no in her life, never faced consequences for her cruelty, never imagined that power came in forms she couldn't see or control. She stopped 3 feet from Aaliyah, close enough that Aaliyah could smell her expensive perfume mixing with rain and malice. "You should have thought about this before you got pregnant," Patricia said, each word precisely articulated, designed to cut. "Before you thought you could trap my son with a baby. Before you presumed you belonged in our family." Our family, as if Aaliyah had never been part of it. As if 3 years of marriage, 3 years of Sunday dinners and holidays, and pretending not to hear the whispered comments about appropriate wives and our kind of people, had never bought her even the smallest claim to belonging. "Where will you even go?" Patricia continued, warming to her theme now. "Back to whatever it was you came from? That apartment in Washington you never talk about? Those family members you're supposedly estranged from?" She stepped closer, and Aaliyah saw Ryan tense not to intervene. But like someone watching a car accident, they knew they should stop but couldn't quite bring themselves to move. "You have nothing," Patricia said, her voice dropping to something intimate and poisonous. "No family, no money, no prospects. Just a pregnant belly and a history of poor decisions." The rain fell harder. Or maybe Aaliyah was just more aware of it now. Of the cold seeping into her bones, of her maternity dress clinging to her frame, of how she must look to the neighbors whose curtains were definitely twitching behind dark windows. But she didn't speak, didn't defend herself, didn't beg. She just watched Patricia's face, cataloging the contempt, the certainty, the absolute conviction that this moment was righteous and overdue. "Nothing to say?" Patricia asked, and for the first time, something like uncertainty crept into her voice. "No tears? No pleading?" Aaliyah met her eyes, really met them, and Patricia faltered slightly. Because there was something in Aaliyah's gaze that didn't match the narrative Patricia had constructed. Not defeat, not desperation. Something else entirely. Something that looked almost like pity. "You disgust me," Patricia hissed, and then, with a deliberateness that seemed to slow time itself, she spat directly into Aaliyah's face. The saliva struck Aaliyah's left cheek, just below her eye. Behind Patricia, Ryan made a sound sharp, involuntary, the noise of someone watching a line being crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. But Aaliyah didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her hand immediately to wipe her face. Instead, she smiled. It was a small smile, sad and knowing, the expression of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this moment, not hoping for it, but knowing it would come. And that cruelty this deep always eventually revealed itself completely. Her hand moved to her coat pocket with unhurried precision. The phone she pulled out wasn't the basic smartphone Ryan had seen her use for 3 years. It was sleek, professional, with the understated design of something issued by people who didn't advertise their authority. She raised it to her ear. One button press, no scrolling, no searching. Like the number was saved as a single-touch contact labeled emergency, or last resort, or simply mother. "Mom," Aaliyah said, her voice calm and clear despite the rain soaking through her clothes, despite the spit on her face, despite everything. "They put me out. I'm pregnant." Patricia's face transformed, triumph to confusion, to something that looked almost like recognition, like a criminal suddenly understanding that the courtroom they'd walked into so confidently was about to become the site of their undoing. "Aaliyah," Patricia whispered, and it was the first time she'd used that name, Aaliyah's actual name, instead of "that girl" or "your wife." "Aaliyah Brooks," Patricia said again, and her voice had gone thin, reedy, all the authority draining out like water from a cracked glass. On the phone, a voice responded too quiet for Ryan or Patricia to hear the words, but the tone carried. Professional, measured, deadly serious. "I'm still at the house," Aaliyah said into the phone, her eyes never leaving Patricia's face. "Yes, the one they're so proud of." Patricia's knees buckled slightly. She grabbed for the porch railing, her expensive manicure scraping against wet wood. "Mom," Aaliyah said, and there was something in that word, warmth, trust, connection, that Ryan had never heard in 3 years of marriage. "It's time." She paused, listening. "Yes, now would be perfect." Another pause, briefer. "20 minutes, I'll be here." She lowered the phone, tucked it back into her pocket with the same unhurried precision, and finally raised her hand to wipe the spit from her face. 3 years, she said quietly, looking at Patricia, then at Ryan. 3 years of testing, of watching, of giving you every opportunity to choose kindness, to see me as human, to offer even the smallest gesture of basic respect. Her hand moved to her belly, protective and tender. "Thank you for making it so clear. Thank you for showing me, without any ambiguity left, exactly who you both are." Ryan found his voice, hoarse and desperate. "Aaliyah, who did you just call? What?" But she wasn't listening anymore. She was looking past them, past the house, toward the street where headlights would appear in exactly 19 minutes. Patricia had sunk onto the porch steps, her wool coat soaking through, her face the color of old paper. "Brooks," she whispered. "Monica Brooks." And Aaliyah smiled again, that same small, sad smile, and said nothing at all. Because some truths didn't need explanation. Some revelations spoke for themselves. And some phone calls changed everything. 3 years earlier, Aaliyah Brooks had walked into a Columbia University professional networking event with one goal: to be someone other than Monica Brooks' daughter for a single evening. She'd chosen her outfit carefully, a simple dress from Target, modest jewelry from a street vendor in Union Square, shoes that were comfortable rather than designer. Everything calculated to signal graduate student on a budget rather than daughter of the most feared prosecutor in New York State. The event was full of aspiring consultants and finance professionals, people who measured success in salary brackets and corporate ladders. People who had no reason to know that the quiet black woman refilling her coffee in the corner had grown up in a Georgetown townhouse where Supreme Court justices came to dinner. Ryan Caldwell had approached her at the networking table, his smile practiced but not insincere, his handshake firm without being aggressive. "Ryan Caldwell," he'd said, "financial consulting. You're in the public policy program?" "Aaliyah," she'd replied, leaving off her last name deliberately. "First year, still figuring out what I want to focus on." That wasn't entirely true. Aaliyah knew exactly what she wanted to focus on: living a life where her mother's reputation didn't precede her, where relationships weren't calculated based on access to power, where she could be seen for herself. Ryan had seemed perfect for that experiment. Middle management at a mid-sized consulting firm. Ambitious but not ruthless. No family connections to law enforcement or politics. Just a regular guy trying to make his way in the world. Their courtship had been brief but intense. Coffee dates that turned into long walks through Central Park. Dinners at affordable restaurants where they split the bill. Conversations about the future that felt genuine, unforced. When Ryan proposed 8 months later with a modest ring he'd clearly saved for, presenting it during a walk across the Brooklyn Bridge at sunset, Aaliyah had said yes without hesitation. She'd said yes because he'd never once asked about her family. She'd said yes because he seemed content with who she presented herself as. She'd said yes because she thought maybe, finally, she'd found someone who could love her without leverage, without calculation. She'd been catastrophically wrong. The first warning sign came at their engagement party, a small gathering at Ryan's mother's house in Westchester. Patricia Caldwell had greeted Aaliyah with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and a handshake that lasted exactly 1 second too short to be genuinely warm. "So lovely to finally meet you," Patricia had said, her gaze sweeping over Aaliyah's department store dress with clinical assessment. "Ryan's told me so much about you. Though I must confess, I had to piece together quite a bit, since you're apparently quite mysterious about your background." "Not mysterious," Aaliyah had replied carefully. "Just private. My family and I aren't close." "How convenient," Patricia had murmured, and something in her tone made Aaliyah's instincts the ones honed by growing up watching her mother dismantle lies in courtrooms, activate like an alarm system. But Ryan had been attentive that night, protective even, steering conversations away when his mother's questions became too pointed. And Aaliyah had told herself she was being paranoid, oversensitive. The wedding had been small. Aaliyah's side of the church nearly empty, just a few Columbia classmates and her mother, sitting alone in the front row wearing understated elegance and an expression that managed to convey both support and concern. Monica hadn't objected to the marriage, hadn't offered warnings or interrogated Ryan's background. She'd simply hugged her daughter and said, "I respect your choice. I'll always be here when you need me." At the time, Aaliyah had been grateful. Now, standing in October rain 3 years later, she understood those words differently. Her mother had known, had seen exactly what Aaliyah was trying to prove, and had chosen to let her daughter learn the lesson firsthand. The marriage's slow erosion began almost immediately. Patricia's visits increased, first monthly, then weekly, then several times a week, always with a comment designed to remind Aaliyah of her place. "Ryan, darling, you really should consider joining the Greenwich Country Club. Your father and I know several members. Of course, there's a vetting process. They're quite particular about the type of families they accept." The emphasis on type was never explained. It didn't need to be. "Have you thought about where you'll send your children to school? The public schools in this area are adequate, I suppose. But the private schools, the ones that really matter, they have legacy preferences. Family connections are so important." Family connections Aaliyah supposedly lacked. Ryan had never defended her. Not once in 3 years. Instead, he'd absorbed his mother's poison, letting it reshape his perception until he looked at his wife and saw only what Patricia had taught him to see. An obstacle to advancement, a weight dragging him down, a mistake that needed correction. The pregnancy announcement, 6 months ago, had been the catalyst for everything that followed. Aaliyah had been terrified to tell him. She'd prepared dinner, his favorite meal. She'd set the table with candles. She'd rehearsed what she'd say. Ryan had arrived home late, distracted, barely tasting the food. "I have something to tell you," Aaliyah had said, her hands shaking slightly as she placed the pregnancy test on the table between them. Ryan had stared at it for a long moment. Then he'd looked at her with an expression she'd never seen before. Not anger, not joy, not even surprise. Just calculation. "Are you sure you want to keep it?" he'd asked. 7 words that had destroyed whatever remained of Aaliyah's hope. "It's our baby," she'd said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's a complication," Ryan had replied. "My career is at a critical point. My mother's been talking to people about opportunities. This is not good timing." Aaliyah had chosen peace that night. She'd swallowed the hurt, the fury, the devastating realization that her husband saw their child as a strategic liability rather than a person. Patricia's hostility had intensified immediately after the announcement. Suddenly, every visit included comments about women who trap men with pregnancies, and the kind of girls who see a meal ticket instead of a partner, and poor Ryan, burdened with responsibilities he never asked for. And Ryan had let it happen. Had sat there, saying nothing, as his mother systematically dehumanized his pregnant wife. For 6 months, Aaliyah had endured. For 6 months, she'd told herself this was temporary, that parenthood would change things. For 6 months, she'd protected people who had never once protected her. Until tonight, standing in October rain, when she'd finally understood, she'd been conducting an experiment in human decency. And Ryan Caldwell had failed so completely, so consistently, so publicly, that even she, who'd spent 3 years making excuses for him, could no longer deny the results. She'd married a coward who loved his mother's approval more than his wife's humanity. And now, with one phone call, she was going to stop protecting him from the consequences of that choice. 28 years earlier, Monica Brooks had stood in a Washington, D.C. delivery room and made a promise to the infant daughter in her arms. I will never let them make you small. It was a promise born from experience. Monica had clawed her way from a working-class neighborhood in Baltimore to Yale Law School, then to the U.S. Attorney's office, then to the pinnacle of prosecutorial power, and every step had required her to be twice as good, twice as prepared, twice as untouchable as any white counterpart. She'd learned to be ruthless in courtrooms and gentle nowhere else. She'd learned that power was the only protection that mattered. She'd built her career on ensuring no criminal, no matter how wealthy, how connected, how convinced of their own invincibility, could escape consequences when she decided they'd crossed the line. And she'd raised her daughter in that world of institutional power, of federal investigations and Supreme Court precedent, of dinner conversations that casually referenced senators and cabinet secretaries. Aaliyah had grown up in a Georgetown townhouse where security was discreet but ever-present, where reporters sometimes camped outside during high-profile cases, where her mother's name carried enough weight that teachers treated her differently, that potential friends calculated whether her friendship was worth the association with that prosecutor's daughter. By the time Aaliyah was 16, she understood. She would never be seen as herself. She would always be Monica Brooks' daughter, first and foremost. Her achievements would be attributed to her mother's connections. Her failures would be scrutinized as reflections on her mother's judgment. It was suffocating. At 18, Aaliyah had told her mother, I want to go to Columbia, not Yale, not Harvard, somewhere you didn't go, where your name doesn't open doors before I walk through them. Monica had looked at her daughter for a long moment, this brilliant, gentle girl who somehow hadn't inherited her mother's taste for combat, and had simply nodded. I understand, she'd said, and I'll respect whatever life you choose to build. It had been the greatest gift Monica could give, permission to be invisible. Aaliyah had chosen public policy instead of law, had rented a modest apartment, had taken a part-time job at a nonprofit, despite the trust fund that could have supported her comfortably, had introduced herself by first name only, and carefully edited her past. She'd wanted normal. She'd wanted to be seen. And when she'd met Ryan Caldwell at that Columbia networking event, she'd thought maybe finally she'd found someone who could love her for herself. Now, standing in Westchester rain, her phone still warm in her pocket from the call she'd just made, Aaliyah understood her mother's gift differently. Monica hadn't been giving permission for invisibility. She'd been giving her daughter space to learn what the world looked like without protection, to understand viscerally why protection mattered in the first place. In her mind, Aaliyah could picture the scene playing out in Washington right now. Her mother, sitting in her home office overlooking the Potomac, the one with built-in bookshelves filled with law texts and case files, the phone still in her hand. Her expression, the one Aaliyah had seen in photographs from courtrooms, focused, precise, already 3 moves ahead. Monica wouldn't be panicking. She wouldn't be emotional. She would be doing what she'd been trained to do for 30 years, assessing the situation, identifying the relevant laws, determining the appropriate response, and executing with the full weight of institutional power behind her. The conversation had been brief, professional, almost. They put me out, Aaliyah had said. I'm pregnant. Where are you? Monica's voice had been steady, but Aaliyah had heard the undertone, not anger yet, but something colder. Still at the house, Westchester County. Same address. Are you injured? No. Wet, cold, but not injured. Do you need medical attention? I should probably get checked. For the baby. A pause. So brief most people wouldn't notice, but Aaliyah knew her mother. That pause was Monica recalibrating, moving from concerned parent to chief prosecutor. I'm leaving now, Monica had said. Stay visible. Stay on the street. If they approach you again, Walk to where there are witnesses. I'll have people there in 20 minutes. Mom, save it for when I arrive. Right now, just exist. Just be present. The rest, we'll handle appropriately. And then, just before hanging up, Aaliyah, you're not alone. You haven't been alone for 3 years. I've just been respecting your choice to fight your own battles. But when someone puts my pregnant daughter on a street in October rain, that's when it stops being your battle and starts being mine. Now, in Westchester, 17 minutes after that call, Aaliyah watched Ryan pace on the porch while Patricia sat on the steps, looking like someone who'd just realized they'd walked into a courtroom, thinking they were untouchable, and discovered the judge already knew every lie they'd ever told. Headlights appeared at the end of the street. Not one vehicle. 4. Black SUVs with government plates, moving with coordinated precision that spoke of federal training and institutional backing. Patricia made a sound, half gasp, half sob. Ryan stopped pacing. And Aaliyah, soaked through and shivering slightly, smiled as the first vehicle pulled into the driveway where her luggage still sat in puddles. Because some women didn't need to raise their voices. They just needed to make one phone call to someone who'd spent 30 years ensuring that power bowed to law. And her mother had just arrived. The emergency room at White Plains Hospital was quiet at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. The kind of quiet that made every sound seem louder than it should, the squeak of nurses' shoes, the beep of monitors, the soft murmur of someone receiving news they didn't want to hear. Aaliyah sat on an examination table, while Dr. Sarah Chen pressed the ultrasound wand against her belly with practiced gentleness. "Baby's heartbeat is strong," Dr. Chen said, her voice carrying that careful neutrality doctors learned when they suspected there was more to a patient's story. "No signs of distress, but I want to keep you for observation, given the circumstances." The circumstances being that Aaliyah had arrived escorted by 2 U.S. Marshals and a woman who'd introduced herself as Assistant Chief Prosecutor Amanda Chen, no relation to the doctor, but definitely related to someone who'd made a phone call that got a medical team assembled at midnight. Monica Brooks hadn't come inside. She'd stayed in the parking lot, making phone calls with the controlled intensity of someone activating a network that had been dormant but never dismantled. Through the window, Aaliyah could see her mother's silhouette in the back of the Lincoln, phone pressed to her ear, occasionally gesturing with the precision of someone laying out a case to people who couldn't afford to tell her no. "Your mother seems very organized," Dr. Chen offered. "She's thorough," Aaliyah replied, and allowed herself a small smile at the understatement. Thorough didn't begin to cover it. In the 90 minutes since arriving in Westchester, Monica had done what she did best: transformed personal injury into institutional response, private wrong into public consequence. Amanda Chen had arrived with the first wave, carrying a tablet and wearing the expression of someone who'd spent years as Monica Brooks' chief of staff and had learned to anticipate requirements 3 moves ahead. "Ma'am," she'd said, approaching Aaliyah in the hospital waiting room, "we need to document everything. I know you're tired, but this is time-sensitive." Aaliyah had nodded and spent 20 minutes recounting the evening in precise detail while Amanda took notes. Not leading questions, just careful documentation of facts, times, exact words spoken, witnesses present. "The spit?" Amanda had asked, her voice neutral but her jaw tight. "Yes." "On your face while you were pregnant after being evicted from your residence?" "Yes." Amanda had made a note, and Aaliyah had seen her mouth form a word that might have been perfect or might have been something less professional. Now, with the ultrasound complete and her baby confirmed safe, Aaliyah was moved to a private room. A U.S. Marshal stationed himself discreetly outside the door. A nurse brought warm blankets and tea without being asked. And Monica finally came inside. She looked exactly as Aaliyah remembered from childhood, poised, controlled, dressed in a way that suggested power without advertising it. But there was something in her eyes that Aaliyah hadn't seen in years. The cold fury of a prosecutor who'd just been handed a case they intended to win so thoroughly that opposing counsel would remember it as a cautionary tale. "The baby?" Monica asked, sitting in the chair beside Aaliyah's bed. "Fine. Strong heartbeat, no distress." "Good." Monica's shoulders relaxed fractionally. "I've made some calls. There are things in motion. I wanted to brief you before." "Mom." Aaliyah's voice was quiet but firm. "What did you do?" Monica looked at her daughter for a long moment, and Aaliyah saw the prosecutor recede slightly, replaced by the mother who'd raised her, who'd let her go, who'd spent 3 years respecting her daughter's choice to live without protection. "What I should have done 3 years ago," Monica said. "When you told me you wanted to see if love without leverage existed, when you made me promise not to interfere." She reached out and took Aaliyah's hand, a rare gesture of physical affection from a woman who'd learned to be made of armor and precedent. "I kept that promise, but he broke yours. And when someone puts my pregnant daughter on a street in the rain, that's when promises end and consequences begin." "What kind of consequences?" Monica pulled out her phone, scrolled through something, then handed it to Aaliyah. The screen showed a legal document, Emergency Protective Order, filed in Westchester County Family Court at 11:23 p.m., granted at 11:31 p.m. Ryan Caldwell was ordered to maintain 500 feet distance from Aaliyah Brooks Caldwell. Patricia Caldwell was listed as co-respondent. "That's just the beginning," Monica said quietly. "By morning there will be a temporary restraining order preventing either of them from disposing of marital assets. The house deed is being reviewed for irregularities in how the down payment was sourced. Preliminary review suggests Patricia's financial involvement may have tax implications. Neither of them disclosed properly." Aaliyah stared at the document. "You did all this in 90 minutes? I've spent 30 years building relationships with every judge, clerk, and law enforcement official in the state. When I make a call, people answer. When I say something needs to happen immediately, it happens." Monica's expression softened slightly. "But more importantly, you documented everything. 3 years of text messages, emails, recorded voicemails from Patricia. You never deleted anything." "I didn't know I was documenting. I just kept everything." "Your training?" Monica said with something that might have been pride. "You grew up watching me build cases. You couldn't help but preserve evidence, even when you didn't know you'd need it." Amanda Chen appeared in the doorway, tablet in hand. "Ma'am, the housing injunction is filed. Judge Morrison will review at 9 a.m., but given the emergency protective order and the pregnancy, he's indicated he'll grant temporary exclusive possession to your daughter, pending full hearing." Monica nodded. "The financial audit?" "Aig's office has questions. They'll want to interview Mr. Caldwell about the source of his down payment and whether his mother's contribution was properly documented for tax purposes. Given her tax bracket and the amount involved, there are irregularities." Translation: Monica had found something, or created a reason for someone to find something, and Ryan's comfortable life was about to become very uncomfortable. "And the employer?" Monica asked. "Richardson Consulting received an inquiry this afternoon about their compliance with workplace harassment policies. Apparently, there have been some complaints about Mr. Caldwell's conduct. Nothing formal yet, but HR has been advised to review." Aaliyah looked at her mother. "Did you—" "I made inquiries," Monica said calmly, "asked questions, suggested areas of concern. I didn't fabricate anything. If his employer finds problems, those problems existed before I started asking questions." She stood, smoothing her suit jacket with the precision of someone preparing for battle. "Right now, they're at home thinking they won. Thinking you're powerless, pregnant, and alone. By morning, they'll start understanding otherwise. But the real revelation? That comes when I arrive in person." "When?" Aaliyah asked. "Tomorrow, 10 a.m. I've arranged a meeting at their residence. Ryan and Patricia have been informed that legal counsel wishes to discuss the situation. They think it's you trying to negotiate. They don't know yet that it's me. Will you tell them?" Monica's expression was the one Aaliyah had seen in news photographs, the one that made defense attorneys nervous before she ever said a word. "I'll introduce myself," Monica said, "and then I'll explain, very carefully, very thoroughly, exactly how the law works when you assault a pregnant woman. How protective orders work, how financial audits work, how employer liability works when harassment claims are filed." She moved toward the door, then paused. "Get some rest. You're safe here. Tomorrow, they learn that the woman they threw away wasn't alone. She just let them think she was." At precisely 10 a.m., 3 black vehicles pulled into the driveway of Ryan Caldwell's Westchester County home. Ryan had been awake since 4 a.m., pacing, checking his phone, waiting for something. The protective order that had been served at 6:47 a.m. by a deputy who'd been professionally polite but completely unsympathetic. The call from his employer at 7:15 a.m. asking him to take a few days off while HR reviewed some concerns. The email from his mortgage company at 8:03 a.m. requesting additional documentation about the source of his down payment. Everything was falling apart with terrifying speed, and Ryan couldn't understand how. Less than 12 hours ago, he'd thrown his wife out. 12 hours ago, his mother had assured him this was the right choice. Now he was standing in his living room, watching through the window as a woman in her late 50s emerged from the middle vehicle with the kind of presence that made you stand up straighter without thinking about it. "Who is that?" Ryan asked, not really expecting his mother to answer. Patricia had been silent all morning, sitting in the same chair she'd occupied since the protective order was served, her face the color of old paper, her hands shaking so badly she'd spilled coffee twice. "Monica Brooks," Patricia whispered, "Chief Prosecutor for the state of New York." "What?" Ryan turned to stare at his mother. "Why would the Chief Prosecutor?" "Because," Patricia said, and her voice sounded nothing like the woman who'd spent 3 years demolishing Aaliyah's confidence. "That's who we put on the street last night. That's whose daughter we humiliated." The doorbell rang. Not a harsh buzz, but a calm, professional ring. Like someone who had all the time in the world and knew you'd answer eventually. Ryan's hands shook as he opened the door. Monica Brooks stood on his porch, flanked by 2 people in professional attire, one holding a tablet, one holding a leather portfolio that probably contained things Ryan really didn't want to see. "Mr. Caldwell," Monica said, her voice professionally neutral. "I'm Monica Brooks. I represent your wife, Aaliyah Brooks Caldwell. May we come in?" She didn't wait for permission. She simply walked past him with the authority of someone who'd entered hundreds of rooms, knowing she was the most dangerous person present. Patricia stood as Monica entered the living room, and something in her posture suggested she'd been expecting this, dreading this, knowing that every cruel word she'd spoken would come back to haunt her in exactly this form. "Mrs. Caldwell," Monica said, and it wasn't a greeting, it was an acknowledgement. "Please sit." It wasn't a request. Patricia sat. Monica remained standing. The positioning was deliberate prosecutor's instinct, trial attorney's training, the subtle establishment of hierarchy that happened before any words were spoken. "Let me be clear about why I'm here," Monica began, her voice carrying the precise articulation of someone who delivered opening statements in capital cases. "Last night, at approximately 10:15 p.m., my daughter, 6 months pregnant, was forcibly removed from her residence during a rainstorm. Her belongings were thrown onto a public sidewalk with enough force to damage them. She was subjected to verbal abuse, harassment, and finally, physical assault when Mrs. Patricia Caldwell spat on her face. She paused, letting that sink in. Those are facts, documented facts. There were neighbors watching. There are text messages. There are voicemails. There is a paper trail going back 3 years documenting systematic emotional abuse, harassment, and what New York law defines as domestic violence against a pregnant person. Ryan's throat closed. "I didn't hit her. I never." "You threw her onto a street while pregnant," Monica said, and her voice didn't rise but somehow got quieter, more dangerous. "You allowed your mother to assault her. You deprived her of shelter during inclement weather. Under New York domestic relations law, those actions constitute abuse. Under New York penal law, your mother's conduct constitutes assault. Would you like me to cite the relevant statutes, or would you prefer to consult with an attorney first?" Silence. Complete, devastating silence. "I thought not," Monica continued. She nodded to Amanda Chen, who opened the tablet and began reading in a voice trained for court proceedings. "Filed this morning in Westchester County Court. Emergency protective order requiring both Ryan and Patricia Caldwell to maintain 500 feet distance from Aaliyah Brooks Caldwell. Granted. Temporary restraining order, preventing disposal or transfer of marital assets pending full hearing. Granted. Motion for exclusive possession of marital residence. Hearing scheduled for Friday at 9 a.m., but given the circumstances, likely to be granted." Amanda looked up. "The house Mr. Caldwell is currently standing in? As of Friday, he won't be living here. His pregnant wife, whom he evicted, will be." Patricia made a sound like someone had struck her. Monica continued as if she hadn't heard. "Additionally, the New York State Attorney General's office has opened an inquiry into the financial arrangements surrounding the purchase of this property. Specifically, whether Patricia Caldwell's contribution to the down payment was properly documented for tax purposes. Initial review suggests irregularities." That's, that's not, Patricia stammered. True? Monica's smile was professional and completely terrifying. Then you'll have no problem providing documentation. The AG's office will be in touch. She turned her attention back to Ryan. Your employer, Richardson Consulting, has been made aware of complaints regarding your conduct. I understand you've been asked to take leave while they review. That's their decision, of course. I simply made inquiries about their harassment policies. Ryan felt the ground disappearing beneath him. Everything, job, house, reputation, unraveling with the precision of someone pulling specific threads to collapse an entire structure. What do you want? He managed to ask. Monica's expression didn't change. I want my daughter and her child safe. That's already happening. Everything else? She gestured to Amanda, who handed her a document from the leather portfolio. This is a proposed settlement agreement. You will grant your wife full custody of the child. You will agree to supervise visitation only, pending psychological evaluation. You will surrender any claim to marital property beyond what your attorney can demonstrate you contributed independently. You will agree to restraining orders, preventing contact except through legal representatives. She placed the document on the coffee table. Or, Monica continued, we proceed through the courts. Discovery will be extensive. Your finances will be examined thoroughly. Your mother's finances will be examined thoroughly. Every text message, every email, every voicemail will be entered into evidence. The abuse will be documented publicly. Your employer will be subpoenaed regarding your conduct. And by the time we're done, you won't just lose the house and your parental rights, you'll be explaining to potential employers why your name appears in case law as an example of domestic abuse. Patricia was crying now. Not the dignified tears of someone sympathetic, but the desperate sobs of someone realizing that the authority they'd spent a lifetime wielding meant nothing in front of someone with actual institutional power. You can't do this, Patricia whispered. Monica turned to look at her fully for the first time, and Patricia physically recoiled. Mrs. Caldwell, Monica said, her voice dropping to something almost conversational, which somehow made it more frightening. I've spent 30 years putting people in prison. Criminals who thought their money protected them. Executives who thought their lawyers could outmaneuver me. Politicians who thought their connections made them untouchable. Every single one of them said, at some point, you can't do this. She stepped closer, and Patricia pressed back in her chair. I buried them all, legally, procedurally, by the book, and when their appeals were exhausted and their options were gone, they understood. I absolutely could do this. Because I'm not interested in revenge. I'm interested in consequences. And consequences, Mrs. Caldwell, are what happen when you mistake my daughter's kindness for weakness. She straightened, smoothing her suit jacket. You have 48 hours to review the settlement agreement with your attorney. If you choose to fight this in court, I'll be there. Not as prosecutor, I can't do that in a civil matter. But as a mother who will ensure that every law, every statute, every protection designed to defend pregnant women from abuse is deployed with absolute precision. Monica moved toward the door, then paused. My daughter and her child will be safe, she said, and it wasn't a promise, it was a fact. Spoken with the authority of someone who'd spent 3 decades making facts out of justice. Everything else will follow the law, but I think you'll find, Mr. Caldwell, Mrs. Caldwell, that the law is far more terrifying than any personal vendetta could ever be. The door closed behind her with a soft, final sound. In the silence that followed, Ryan and Patricia sat in the living room of a house they might not own in a week, facing consequences that had arrived with the unstoppable force of institutional power deployed with surgical precision. And somewhere in a hospital room in White Plains, Aaliyah Brooks Caldwell rested with one hand on her pregnant belly, finally safe, finally protected, finally free from the burden of making herself small for people who'd never deserved her gentleness in the first place. Because some women don't raise their voices when they're wronged. They raise the law. And the law, when wielded by someone who knows exactly how to use it, is absolutely devastating. The collapse began on Thursday morning at 9:47 a.m. when Ryan's phone rang. Ryan, it's Tom. We need you to come to HR, now. Not when you're available. Not at your convenience, now. Ryan had been sitting at his kitchen table, the table Aaliyah had found at an estate sale, and refinished by hand, staring at the settlement agreement Monica Brooks had left 48 hours earlier. The words kept blurring together. Supervised visitation, financial disclosure, psychological evaluation, restraining order. I'm on leave, Ryan said, his voice hoarse from too little sleep. HR told me. This isn't optional. Be here in an hour. The line went dead. At Richardson Consulting's corporate office in Manhattan, Ryan was led not to HR's usual conference room, but to a smaller windowless space where three people waited. His supervisor, Tom, HR director, Karen Phillips, and a woman he didn't recognize wearing a suit that screamed legal counsel. Mr. Caldwell, Karen began without preamble, we've received formal complaints regarding your conduct with subordinate female employees. Specifically, comments about appearance, marital status, and family planning that constitute workplace harassment under both company policy and New York state law. Ryan's throat closed. What? I never who said. The complaints are credible and corroborated? The lawyer interjected. We've also been contacted by the State Attorney General's office regarding your wife's employment discrimination claim. My wife doesn't work here. No, but she worked at a nonprofit where you served on the advisory board. There are questions about whether her departure was truly voluntary or if she was pressured to leave. The room tilted. Aaliyah had quit her nonprofit job 2 years ago. Ryan had barely paid attention at the time, too focused on his own career trajectory. Now every decision, every moment, every casual cruelty was being re-examined through a lens that made everything look calculated, predatory, abusive. Pending the investigation's conclusion, Karen continued, your employment is suspended without pay. You'll surrender your company, laptop, phone, and building access immediately. If the investigation substantiates the complaints, termination will follow. 20 minutes later, Ryan stood on the Manhattan sidewalk holding a box with 3 years of desk decorations, watching his career evaporate like morning fog. His phone buzzed. The mortgage company, third call this week. Mr. Caldwell, we've been trying to reach you regarding irregularities in your loan application. Specifically, the source of your down payment and whether your mother's contribution was properly disclosed as a gift subject to IRS reporting requirements. That's my mother gave me that money years ago. That's not. If the gift exceeded the annual exclusion amount and wasn't properly reported, both you and the donor could face tax penalties. We're required to report suspected irregularities to the IRS. We'll need complete documentation within 7 business days, or we may need to freeze the account pending resolution. Freeze the account, meaning he couldn't access the equity, couldn't refinance, couldn't sell without clearing the investigation. The house, his proof of success, his escape from his parents' middle-class neighborhood, his symbol of having made it, was now a trap. By Thursday evening, Patricia's facade had completely crumbled. She sat in Ryan's living room, phone in her shaking hands, scrolling through messages from her country club friends that had gone from sympathetic to distant to non-existent as word spread about that awful situation with the Brooks woman. The Brooks woman. As if anyone in Westchester could hear that name and not know exactly who it referenced. As if Monica Brooks wasn't the kind of person whose professional reputation preceded her like a weather system, and you either took shelter or got destroyed. They're canceling me, Patricia whispered, showing Ryan her phone. The Greenwich Garden Society removed me from the gala committee. The club president said my membership is under review. Margaret Henderson won't return my calls. Ryan wanted to feel sympathy, but all he could think was, you did this. You spat on a pregnant woman and called her worthless. You pushed and pushed until she finally pushed back. And she pushed back with the full weight of institutional power you never imagined she possessed. His phone rang again. Unknown number. Mr. Caldwell? This is Detective Sarah Martinez, Westchester County Sheriff's Office. We've received a complaint regarding an incident on October 15th involving alleged assault and unlawful eviction. We need you and Patricia Caldwell to come to the station for questioning. Questioning? We didn't, she walked away. We didn't hurt. Sir, evicting a pregnant woman during inclement weather constitutes reckless endangerment in New York. Your mother's alleged physical contact, the spitting, is documented assault. We have witness statements, photographs, and medical records. This is serious. You can come voluntarily with counsel, or we can issue a summons. Ryan looked at his mother, who'd heard enough of the conversation to understand. Her face had gone the color of old milk. We'll come, Ryan said, with our lawyer. Except they didn't have a lawyer. Not one who specialized in criminal defense. Not one who could fight someone like Monica Brooks. That night, Ryan drove past the hospital in White Plains. Not to see Aaliyah, the protective order prevented that, but to understand how completely the situation had inverted. 3 days ago, he'd stood in his house, throwing her belongings into rain, feeling powerful and righteous and certain he was making the correct choice for his future. Now he was suspended from work, under investigation by multiple agencies, facing potential criminal charges, and watching his mother's social standing disintegrate in real time. And Aaliyah? She was in a private hospital room, protected by you, marshals with the full support of the New York State legal apparatus, and a mother who demonstrated in 48 hours what real power looked like when deployed with prosecutorial precision. The notification arrived Friday morning. Manhattan Supreme Court, Family Division, Emergency Hearing, Brooks Caldwell Matter, Monday 9 a.m., Judge Morrison presiding. The summons that would make everything official. The moment when Ryan would finally understand that some battles aren't fought with raised voices or physical force, they're fought with documentation, legal precedent, and the terrifying realization that the woman you threw away was never helpless. She was just waiting for you to reveal exactly who you were before she revealed exactly who she'd always been. Monday morning arrived with October sunlight cutting through Manhattan's skyline like judgment, illuminating the steps of the Supreme Court building, where Ryan Caldwell stood with his hastily retained attorney, Marcus Webb, whose retainer had consumed most of Ryan's accessible savings. "Remember," Marcus said, adjusting his briefcase, "say nothing unless I indicate. Don't react emotionally. The judge is looking for stability, responsibility." "I know how to behave in court," Ryan snapped, then immediately regretted the tone when Marcus gave him a look that said, "That's exactly the attitude that's going to destroy you." Inside, courtroom 7B was smaller than Ryan expected. Not the dramatic television version with soaring ceilings and grand jury boxes, but a functional space where families were dismantled with procedural efficiency. Judge Andrea Morrison sat at the bench, reviewing documents, her expression suggesting she'd seen every variation of human failure, and Ryan's case wasn't even particularly creative. Aaliyah sat at the petitioner's table with her mother and two additional attorneys. She wore a simple dress that accommodated her pregnancy, her hair pulled back, no makeup. She looked exhausted and somehow more dignified than Ryan had ever seen her, like someone who'd stopped performing and started simply existing. She didn't look at him. Patricia had been denied entry. The protective order meant she couldn't be in the same room as Aaliyah, so she waited outside like a defendant's relative relegated to the hallway. "All rise," the clerk called. Judge Morrison looked up, her gaze moving from Aaliyah to Ryan with the clinical assessment of someone who'd already read every filing and formed preliminary conclusions. "Mrs. Brooks Caldwell," she began, and Ryan noticed the judge used Aaliyah's full legal name. "I've reviewed your emergency petition and supporting documentation. Mr. Caldwell, I've reviewed your response, such as it is." Such as it is. The phrase landed like a slap. "Let's establish facts," Judge Morrison continued. "On October 15th, at approximately 10:15 p.m., you, Mr. Caldwell, removed your 6 months pregnant wife from your jointly occupied residence during a rainstorm, correct?" "Your Honor," Marcus interjected, "my client contends the separation was mutually—" "I'm asking Mr. Caldwell, sir, did you or did you not physically remove your pregnant wife's belongings and require her to leave the residence during inclement weather?" Ryan's mouth was dry. Yes, but she could have." "Yes or no suffices. Your mother, Patricia Caldwell, was present during this incident?" "Yes. And according to multiple witness statements, photographic evidence, and medical documentation, your mother spat on your wife's face while she was pregnant and standing on a public sidewalk, correct?" The words hung in the air like an indictment. When spoken in official judicial language, stripped of context and justification, the actions sounded monstrous, which, Ryan was slowly realizing, they were. It was a heated moment. "My mother? Your mother committed assault and battery against a pregnant woman. That's not a heated moment, Mr. Caldwell. That's a crime." Judge Morrison's voice didn't rise, but the temperature in the room dropped. "New York penal law is quite clear on this." She turned to Aaliyah. "Mrs. Brooks Caldwell, do you feel safe in your husband's presence?" "No, Your Honor." Aaliyah's voice was steady, clear. "I'm afraid of him and his mother. I'm afraid for my child." Based on the evidence presented, Judge Morrison said, reviewing her notes, I'm granting the emergency protective order for a period of 6 months, renewable upon review. Mr. Caldwell, you are prohibited from contacting your wife except through legal counsel. You will maintain a distance of no less than 500 feet at all times. Marcus leaned forward. Your Honor, that prevents my client from accessing his residence. Which brings us to the question of the residence, the judge interrupted. Mrs. Brooks Caldwell has filed for exclusive possession of the marital home pending divorce proceedings. Given that she is pregnant, was unlawfully evicted, and has demonstrated financial ability to maintain the property, I'm granting temporary exclusive possession. Ryan's world lurched. That's my house. I paid. Actually, one of Aaliyah's attorneys stood a sharp woman with the bearing of someone who ate opposing counsel for breakfast. Discovery reveals significant irregularities in how the property was financed. Mrs. Patricia Caldwell's contribution to the down payment exceeded IRS gift reporting thresholds and was not properly documented. The Attorney General's office has questions. Your Honor, Marcus tried. Those are civil tax matters that shouldn't impact. They impact my decision because they demonstrate a pattern of financial irregularity and parental interference. Mr. Caldwell, you will vacate the residence within 72 hours. Your wife will take possession. You may retrieve personal belongings under police supervision. The gavel hadn't even fallen yet, and Ryan's life was being dismantled piece by piece with procedural efficiency that felt more devastating than any emotional outburst could have been. Regarding custody and visitation, Judge Morrison continued, given the circumstances, the domestic violence, the assault, the eviction of a pregnant woman, I'm ordering supervised visitation only, pending psychological evaluation of both parties. Mr. Caldwell, you will undergo parenting and anger management classes before unsupervised contact with your child is considered. I never hit her, Ryan's voice cracked. I never. You threw her onto a street while pregnant. You enabled your mother to assault her. You subjected her to psychological abuse documented over 3 years. Violence isn't just physical, Mr. Caldwell. And this court takes domestic violence against pregnant women very seriously. Monica Brooks spoke for the first time, her voice cutting through the courtroom with prosecutorial precision. Your Honor, if I may, the pattern of abuse is extensive and calculated. My daughter endured 3 years of systematic dehumanization, financial control through her husband's deliberate career sabotage, and finally physical assault. This wasn't a mistake. This was methodology. Judge Morrison nodded. Mrs. Brooks, your reputation precedes you. I've read your cases. I know how thoroughly you build them. If you say there's a pattern, I believe you've documented it. She looked at Ryan with something that might have been pity if it weren't so clinical. Mr. Caldwell, here's what you need to understand. Your wife didn't seek revenge. She sought protection. She didn't want to destroy you. She wanted safety. But you and your mother created a situation where those two things became synonymous. The gavel fell. Protective order granted. Exclusive possession granted. Supervised visitation pending evaluation. We'll reconvene in 30 days for permanent orders. Mr. Caldwell, I strongly suggest you comply fully with every requirement. This court does not look kindly on violations. Outside, in the hallway, Patricia grabbed Ryan's arm. What just happened? They can't you have rights? But Ryan wasn't listening. He was watching through the courtroom door as Aaliyah stood, one hand on her belly, speaking quietly to her mother. She looked tired but not broken, resolved but not vengeful. She'd never raised her voice, never threatened, never needed to. She just documented everything, called the one person who understood how systems worked, and let institutional justice do what personal confrontation never could. And Ryan finally understood. He hadn't lost because she fought back. He'd lost because she'd never needed to. The hotel suite overlooked the Hudson River, floor-to-ceiling windows framing Manhattan's evening skyline in golden shadow. Aaliyah sat by the window, one hand on her belly where the baby kicked with increasing frequency, as if reminding her that life continued, that forward motion was possible, that the past 3 years were prologue rather than destiny. Monica entered quietly, carrying 2 cups of tea, and sat in the chair beside her daughter. For several minutes neither spoke. They just watched the river catch light, watched boats cut through water, watched the city transform from day to evening like any other Monday. despite the fact that Aaliyah's entire world had been restructured that morning. "How are you feeling?" Monica finally asked, her voice softer than the prosecutorial tone she'd used in court. "I don't know," Aaliyah admitted. "Relieved? Exhausted? Guilty?" "Guilty?" Monica set down her tea, concerned. "Why guilty?" "Because part of me is glad." Aaliyah's voice was small. "Glad Ryan looked so destroyed. Glad Patricia was crying in the hallway. Glad they finally understand what they did." "What does that make me?" "Human," Monica said simply. "Wanting acknowledgement isn't the same as seeking revenge. You're allowed to feel validated when people who hurt you face consequences." Aaliyah turned to look at her mother. Really look at her. Monica Brooks, chief prosecutor, the woman who'd built a career on ensuring consequences followed actions. But right now, in this hotel room, she was just a mother who'd watched her daughter suffer for 3 years while respecting her choice to fight her own battles. "Why didn't you stop this sooner?" Aaliyah asked, and the question carried 3 years of accumulated hurt. "You knew what was happening. You have resources, power, connections. You could have ended this 2 years ago." Monica met her daughter's eyes steadily. "Because you asked me not to. I was suffering." "I know, and every day I watched you suffer was torture." Monica's voice cracked slightly, a rare display of emotion from a woman who'd learned to be armor. "But you needed to learn something I couldn't teach you." "What?" "That your gentleness was your choice, not your limitation. That your silence was strategic, not weakness. That you were strong even without me." Monica reached out, taking Aaliyah's hand. "If I'd intervened immediately, you would have always wondered, could I have handled it myself? Did I need rescuing? Am I only powerful because of who my mother is?" Aaliyah's eyes filled with tears. "But what if he'd hurt me? What if something happened to the baby? Then I would have destroyed him." Monica's voice dropped to something absolutely certain. "But I was monitoring. I had people watching. The moment he crossed from emotional abuse to physical danger, I was ready. When he put you on that street, that was the line. That was when your experiment ended and my response began." "Experiment," Aaliyah repeated bitterly. "That's all this was? Testing whether I could survive without you?" "No." Monica's grip tightened on her daughter's hand. "Testing whether anyone could love you for yourself. Testing whether the world contained kindness that wasn't calculated. Testing whether you could build a life separate from my shadow." She paused. "You proved you could survive anything, but you also proved what I've always known. You shouldn't have to." The tears came then, not quiet, dignified tears, but the kind that shook Aaliyah's entire body, 3 years of suppressed grief finally finding release. Monica moved to sit beside her daughter, pulling her close with a gentleness that contradicted everything the courtroom had witnessed that morning. "I hate that I needed you," Aaliyah sobbed. "I hate that I couldn't do this alone." "Why?" Monica's voice was fierce. "Why should you have to do everything alone? Strength isn't isolation, baby. Strength is knowing when to ask for help. Knowing when to use the resources available. Knowing when to stop protecting people who would never protect you." "I wanted to be normal." "You are normal. But normal doesn't mean powerless. It doesn't mean accepting abuse. It doesn't mean shrinking yourself to fit someone else's limitations." Monica pulled back to look at her daughter. "You spent 3 years proving you could endure. You don't need to prove that anymore. Now you get to choose what comes next." Aaliyah wiped her face. "What if I make the same mistakes? What if I choose wrong again? Then you'll handle it differently. With more information, more self-awareness, more willingness to use the support systems you have instead of pretending you don't need them." Monica stood, moving back to her chair. "Aaliyah, you didn't fail at marriage. Ryan failed at being a decent human. That's not your responsibility to fix." The baby kicked hard, and Aaliyah laughed despite her tears. "Someone's got opinions." "Smart baby. Already knows their mother is worth defending." Monica smiled. "Speaking of which, have you thought about names?" "Not Brooks," Aaliyah said immediately, then paused. "Or maybe exactly Brooks, not to hide anymore but to claim. To say, this is who I am, and I'm not apologizing for it. That," Monica said quietly, "is the daughter I raised." They sat in comfortable silence as the city outside darkened completely, lights clicking on across Manhattan like stars in a constellation Aaliyah was just learning to navigate by. "Mom," Aaliyah said eventually, "thank you for waiting. for respecting my choice even when it hurt to watch, for being ready when I finally needed you. Monica's expression softened in ways she rarely allowed outside this room, outside this relationship that mattered more than any case, any conviction, any professional triumph. Always, she said. I'm always ready. That's what mothers do. And for the first time in 3 years, Aaliyah felt it. Safety, certainty, the bone-deep knowledge that she wasn't alone, had never been alone, would never be alone again. Not because she was weak, but because she'd finally stopped confusing independence with isolation. She didn't need to be rescued, but she also didn't need to do everything herself. And that realization, that synthesis, was the true beginning of healing. 4 months later, New York Presbyterian Hospital's maternity ward welcomed a baby girl at 3:47 a.m. on a February morning when snow fell soft and silent across Manhattan. Aaliyah Brooks held her daughter, all 7 pounds, 3 ounces of her, and understood what Monica had meant about strength. This wasn't gentle surrender or aggressive dominance. This was pure presence. Being fully alive in this moment, this room, this skin, with no apologies and no performance. She's perfect, Monica whispered from the chair beside the hospital bed, her eyes wet in a way courtrooms never saw. She's ours, Aaliyah corrected, and the pronoun carried weight. Not Ryan's, not the Caldwell family legacy. Theirs. The birth certificate read, Maya Brooks, no hyphenation, no compromise. A name that meant illusion or magic in Sanskrit, and Aaliyah found that fitting her daughter was proof that the strongest magic was simply surviving what was supposed to destroy you. Ryan had requested supervised visitation. The court had denied it pending completion of his mandated programs. He'd completed 3 of 12 anger management sessions before giving up, his lawyer citing scheduling conflicts that everyone understood as he'd stopped trying. Patricia had sent a gift, an elaborate baby basket from Bergdorf's that Monica had returned unopened with a note that said simply, no contact means no contact. Respectfully, Monica Brooks, Chief Prosecutor. The social exile Patricia had feared became complete reality. Her country club membership was not renewed, her charity board positions quietly replaced. The Greenwich Society that had validated her cruelty discovered that Monica Brooks's professional reputation carried more weight than Patricia's social connections, and survival meant choosing sides. They chose the side with institutional power. By March, Ryan's house, the one he'd been so proud of, sold in foreclosure for less than he owed. The tax investigation revealed enough irregularities to result in penalties but not criminal charges. Patricia paid quietly, her carefully cultivated wealth depleted by legal fees and settlements designed to avoid Monica Brooks deciding that prosecution was warranted after all. Aaliyah moved into a brownstone in Brooklyn, purchased with a trust fund she'd never touched during her marriage, furnished with items she chose because she liked them rather than because they'd please someone else. The nursery had windows overlooking a small garden where, come spring, she'd plant vegetables and teach Maya that growing things required patience but not suffering. Monica visited weekly, her schedule carefully maintained around grand jury proceedings and appellate arguments, but her priorities visibly shifted. She'd built her career on ensuring justice for victims who couldn't fight back. Now she understood. Sometimes the victim was her own daughter, and justice meant being present for first smiles and midnight feedings more than it meant another conviction. In May, Aaliyah received divorce papers signed by Ryan, who'd accepted every term without contest. Supervised visitation he'd never exercise. Child support automatically garnished from whatever employment he found. No claim to marital property he'd already lost. She signed them in her kitchen while Maya slept in a bassinet nearby and felt nothing except relief that paperwork was all this required. No drama, no confrontation. Just institutional process, doing what it did best, formalizing the end of something that had been dead for years. The final hearing was perfunctory. Judge Morrison reviewed the agreement, confirmed both parties' accepted terms, and granted the dissolution with the same efficiency she'd used to protect Aaliyah months earlier. Mrs. Brooks, the judge said as Aaliyah gathered her papers, I'm glad to see you looking well. Your daughter? Thriving, Your Honor, thank you. Good. That's what matters. Judge Morrison paused. For what it's worth, you handled this with remarkable dignity. Many people in your position would have sought revenge. You sought protection. There's a difference. Aaliyah smiled. My mother taught me that the law is more devastating than anger could ever be. Your mother taught you correctly. Outside the courthouse, spring sunlight turned Manhattan gold, and Aaliyah stood on the steps with Maya in her carrier, watching people hurry past absorbed in their own dramas, their own disasters, their own choices about whether to accept cruelty or demand better. She took out her phone and texted Monica, who was in Albany for the day. "It's done. We're free." The response came immediately. "You were always free. Now you just know it." Aaliyah walked toward the subway, toward home, toward the life she was building piece by deliberate piece. Maya made small sounds, content and oblivious to the fact that her existence represented her mother's refusal to let anyone make her small ever again. 6 months ago, Aaliyah had stood on a rain-soaked sidewalk in Westchester County, watching her marriage end with the catastrophic suddenness of something that had been dying slowly for years. She'd been scared, pregnant, supposedly powerless. But she'd never been powerless. She'd just been quiet, strategic, documenting everything while giving every opportunity for kindness, for decency, for any sign that Ryan could be the man she'd hoped he might be. He'd failed that test so thoroughly, so publicly, so irreversibly, that even now, watching him fade into the kind of irrelevance reserved for people who mistake cruelty for strength, Aaliyah felt only the distant ache of mourning something that had never really existed. She'd loved a fiction. He'd loved a mirror. Now she loved herself, her daughter, and the future they'd build without apologizing for taking up space. That evening, Aaliyah sat on her Brooklyn brownstone steps, Maya sleeping against her chest, and watched the sunset paint the buildings in shades of ending and beginning. Her phone buzzed with a message from a Columbia classmate she hadn't heard from in years. "Heard about everything. I'm so sorry. Are you okay?" Aaliyah considered her response carefully, then typed, "I'm better than okay. I'm free." And it was true. She was free from performance, from shrinking, from accepting emotional cruelty as the price of being loved, free from protecting people who'd never protected her, free from confusing silence with surrender, gentleness with weakness, peace with powerlessness. She was free because she'd finally understood what her mother had spent 30 years demonstrating, that some women don't need to raise their voices when they're wronged. They just need to raise the law. And the law, when wielded with precision, discipline, and institutional backing, was absolutely devastating. More devastating than any personal confrontation. More permanent than any shouted accusation. More just than any moment of revenge could ever be. Aaliyah looked at her daughter, this perfect, peaceful child, who would grow up knowing that her mother chose her, fought for her, refused to accept abuse as inevitable or deserved. "I'm going to teach you something," Aaliyah whispered to Maya. "Your grandmother taught me, and now I'm teaching you. Gentleness is not weakness. Silence is not surrender. And the strongest thing you can do is know your worth so deeply that no one else's cruelty can make you doubt it." Maya slept on, dreaming infant dreams, safe and warm, and completely unaware that her existence was proof that love, real love, unconditional love, the kind that didn't require you to be smaller to be accepted, was possible. The sun set completely, and Aaliyah carried her daughter inside, into the home she'd claimed, into the life she'd chosen, into the future, where being Monica Brooks' daughter wasn't a burden to hide but a legacy to honor. Because some women don't raise their voices when they're wronged. They raise the law. And then they raise their daughters to know the difference.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Subscribe, like, and click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.